Welcome to Stories and Tea Time with Mrs. Straka. And let's get started. All right. I left you at a bit of a cliffhanger last time, so let's dive back in. Well, of course, everyone crowded around to see what the special pet was, and Bruce, with a silly smile on his dopey face, untied the box and lifted up the lid. What was in the box was a rattlesnake. I guess you can imagine what happened next. All the people shoving and pushing to get away from us got the animals so upset they began to stampede too. The skunk got crowded into a storefront, which scared him, and he did what skunks always do when they get scared. There were calves and goats going every which way, and dogs all went crazy and started chasing anything that ran, and that was everything that there was. Our two cages got upset and squashed, and all the gophers and white rats went skittering off under people's feet. Wool climbed up on top of my head and kept beating his wings so I couldn't see too much of what was happening, but I could still hear it. Women were screaming, and one of the Mounties had hauled out his big revolver and was waving it in the air, while the other one never stopped blowing his silver whistle. All you could hear was yells and howls and barks and screams and yowls. I tell you, there never had been anything like it in Saskatoon for 100 years. We didn't stick around any longer than we could help. We saved the wagons, our two dogs, the owls, and that darn snake. Bruce grabbed the shoebox the moment the ruckus started and stuck to it like a burr until we got back to my house. "Gee," he said as we were getting a drink from our garden hose, "if I'd have lost that old snake, I'd have got my britches tan from here to Mexico. It belongs to our hired man, and it's been his pet for 15 years, ever since he was a cowboy down in Cypress Hills. It's so old it hasn't any teeth nor any poison neither, but he sure is fond of it all the same. It sleeps right with him in his bunk." I still think we should have won first prize. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7. When the owls first came to live with us, Mutt didn't think much of them. He was jealous of all my pets, and he was particularly jealous of the owls, because they took up so much of my time. He never did get on very well with Wool, but after a few weeks he got so that he could tolerate Weeps. I think this was because Weeps was so helpless, and because Mutt had to defend him from other dogs and from the neighborhood cats. And of course, Weeps got very fond of Mutt, knowing he could depend on the old boy to protect him. Whenever Weeps was let out of his cage, he would start searching around for Mutt. Once he spotted him, Weeps would give a little whoop of relief and go scuttling over to his protector's side. If Mutt was lying down, Weeps would snuggle in between his paws. Sometimes he would get so close that his horn feathers would tickle Mutt's nose, and Mutt would sneeze and almost blow Weeps over backwards. If Weeps got to be too much of a nuisance, Mutt would try to hide from him under the garage. But that wasn't much use. Weeps could squeeze under the garage too. He hated to let Mutt get out of his sight, even for a minute. Mutt's relations with Wool were another story, though. Wool wasn't afraid of anything that walked, flew, or crawled, and that included Mutt. As far as Wool was concerned, old Mutt was something to be teased and pestered, and Wool used to tease the life half out of him. Mutt was an absent-minded sort of dog. Instead of burying a bone he didn't happen to be using at the moment, he would often forget about it and leave it lying on the grass. That was a mistake, because sooner or later Wool would see it, swoop down, and carry it off. It wasn't that Wool liked bones himself. Not having any teeth, he couldn't chew them. He just liked to take them away from Mutt. Once he had the bone, he would put it somewhere where Mutt could see it or smell it, but couldn't reach it. Sometimes he would put the bone in a tree, just high enough up so Mutt couldn't jump up and get it. Or sometimes he would hide it in the gutters of the porch roof so that the nice, rich bone smell would drift down and torment Mutt till he nearly went crazy. Another of Wool's tricks was stealing Mutt's dinner. Wool used to be fed on the back porch about 5 o'clock each afternoon. When Wool was feeling particularly bored or ornery, he would play the dinner-stealing game. Having waited until Mutt started eating, Wool would scoot around to the front of the house and set up such a ruckus that it sounded like 2 dog fights and a cat fight all happening at the same time. Mutt always fell for it. As soon as he heard the row, he would start tearing around the corner, woof woof woofing and ready for trouble. But while he was peering around in his short-sighted way to see where the trouble was, Wool would have flown over the top of the house and be gobbling down Mutt's dinner on the back porch. When Mutt got back and found the plate empty, he would look very puzzled. Being absent-minded, he couldn't always remember whether he had finished his dinner or not. All he knew was that he still felt hungry. But Wool's favorite game with Mutt was the tail squeeze. Mutt was already a fairly old dog when the owls came to live with us, and during the heat of the summer afternoons he liked to have a snooze under the poplar trees in our front yard. He had hollowed out a bed for himself in the moist earth beneath the trees, where he could lie in comfort until the sun started to go down and the air began to get a little cooler. Wool, on the other hand, never seemed to sleep at all. although according to the bird books, horned owls are supposed to sleep all day and hunt all night. Perhaps because Wool had never read these books, he was just as active in the daytime as at night, and maybe more so. On summer days, when I was away somewhere and there were no kids around to play with, Wool would get bored. That was usually when he would play the tail squeeze game. That means I need tea when I mess up like that. Hold on. After first making sure Mutt was really fast asleep, Wool would begin to stalk the old dog the way a cat will stalk a bird. He always did it on foot, I think because he felt it wouldn't be playing fair to use his wings. Starting down from the old porch, Wool would sneak across the lawn, moving so slowly and carefully he hardly seemed to move at all. If Mutt happened to raise his head, he would see Wool standing stock still in the grass and staring innocently up at the sky as if he were wondering whether or not it was going to rain. After a long suspicious look at Wool, Mutt's eyelids would begin to droop, his head would sag, and he would soon be fast asleep again. He snored, too, and as soon as the snores started, Wool would continue his slow and careful approach. Sometimes it took Wool an hour or more to cross that lawn, but he did it so quietly and cautiously, Mutt never really had a chance. When he had sneaked up close enough, Wool would raise one big foot and very, very gently lower it over the end of Mutt's long, bushy tail. Then Wool would let out a piercing scream, and at the same moment he would give the tail a good hard squeeze. Poor Mutt would leap straight up into the air, yelping with surprise and pain. By the time he got his bearings and was ready to take a bite out of Wool, the owl would have flown to the limb of a nearby tree, from which he would peer down at Mutt as if to say, "Good heavens, what a terrible nightmare you must have been having." Mutt would roar and froth around the tree, daring Wool to come down and fight like a dog. Then Wool would make things even worse by closing his eyes and pretending to fall sound asleep. Although Wool loved practical jokes, the funny thing was, he never really harmed other animals if he could help it. Of course, if something tried to hurt him, now that was different. Then Wool could be dangerous. But he certainly wasn't the fierce and bloodthirsty kind of bird that owls are supposed to be. He wouldn't even go hunting on his own. If a gopher or white rat happened to get loose on the lawn, he wouldn't touch it. However, there was one kind of animal he would attack, and that was a skunk. It seems that all horned owls just naturally hate skunks. No one knows the reason why. What's more, horned owls are the only things I know of that will eat a skunk, and they even seem to like the taste. Our house in Saskatoon stood close to the river, and along the bank of the river was a regular jungle of bushes and poplar trees, which made an ideal place for skunks to live. Because they didn't have any enemies in town, the riverbank skunks had become so cocky they would stroll along the sidewalk in front of our house as boldly as if they owned it. That was before Wool came to live with us, though. Cocky as ever, one of the riverbank skunks decided to take a walk down Crescent Avenue one summer evening, just after Wool had learned to fly. The skunk came strutting along the sidewalk, quite sure nothing in the world would dare to bother him. He ambled along, taking his time, until he got under the overhanging branches of our poplar trees. Mother and Dad and I were having dinner. The dining room windows were open, because it had been such a hot day. And all of a sudden, there was a great swoosh of wings, and there on the windowsill sat Wool. Before any of us had time to move, he gave a great leap and landed on the floor beside my chair. And he hadn't come empty-handed. Clutched in his talons was an enormous skunk. The skunk was dead, but that didn't help matters much because before he died, he managed to soak himself and Wool with his own special brand of perfume. Hoo, said Wool proudly, which probably meant, mind if I join you? I've brought my supper with me. Nobody stopped to answer. We three people were already stampeding through the door of the dining room, coughing and choking. Wool had to eat his dinner by himself. It was 2 weeks before we could use the dining room again, and when Mother sent the rug and drapes to the cleaners, the man who owned the shop phoned her right back and wanted to know if she was trying to ruin him. Wool didn't smell so sweet either, but he couldn't understand why he was so unpopular all of a sudden. His feelings must have been hurt by the way everybody kept trying to avoid him. After 2 or 3 days, when even I wouldn't go near him or let him come near me, he became very unhappy. Then an idea must have come into his funny head. He must have decided we were mad at him because he hadn't shared his skunk with us. So one day he went down to the riverbank and caught a second skunk and brought it home just for us. By this time, he was so soaked in skunk oil that you could smell him a block away. Some of our neighbors complained about it, and finally my father had to give Wool a bath in about a gallon of tomato juice. Tomato juice is the only thing that will wash away the smell of skunk. Poor Wool. By the time Dad was through with him, he looked like a rag mop that had been dipped in ketchup. But he got the idea, and he never brought skunks home to us again. Chapter 8. The banks of the Saskatchewan River were very steep where the river ran through the prairie to the south of Saskatoon, and about 2 miles downstream from the city was a perfect place for digging caves. Bruce Murray and I had our summer headquarters down there in an old cave that some hobos had dug a long time ago. They had fixed it up with logs and pieces of wood so it wouldn't collapse. You did have to be careful of the... I'm looking ahead a little. Okay, sorry. You did have to be careful of caves, because if they don't have good strong logs to hold up the roof, the whole thing can fall down and kill you. This was a good cave we had, though. My dad had even come there and looked it over to make sure it was safe for us. It had a door made of a piece of tin roofing, and there was a smokestack going up through the ceiling. Inside was a sort of bench where you could lie down, and we had 2 old butter crates for chairs. We had put dry hay down on the floor for a carpet, and under the hay there was a secret hole where we could hide anything that was especially valuable. The river ran only a hop, skip, and a jump away from the door of the cave. There was a big sandbar close by, which made a backwater where the current was slow enough for swimming. Standing right beside the swimming hole was the largest cottonwood tree in the whole of Saskatchewan. One of its branches stuck straight out over the water, and there were old marks on it where a rope had cut into the bark. An Indian who was being chased by Mounties a long, long time ago was supposed to have hanged himself on that branch so the Mounties couldn't catch him alive. We used to go to our cave a couple times a week during the summer holidays, and usually we took the owls along. Wool had learned how to ride on the handlebars of my bicycle, but Weeps couldn't keep his balance there, so we built a kind of box for him and tied it to the carrier behind the seat. Mutt and Rex used to come too, chasing cows whenever they got the chance, or racing away across the prairie after jackrabbits. We would bike out to the end of 3rd Avenue, and then along an old Indian trail that ran along the top of the riverbank. When we got close to the cave, we would hide our bikes in the willows, and then climb down the bank and follow a secret path. There were some pretty tough kids in Saskatoon, and we didn't want them to find our cave if we could help it. Wool loved those trips. All the way out, he would bounce up and down on the handlebars, hooting to himself with excitement, or hooting out insults at any passing dogs. When we came to the place where we would hide the bikes, he would fly up into the poplars and follow us through the tops of the trees. He usually stayed pretty close, though, because if he didn't, some crows would be sure to spot him, and then they would call up all the other crows for miles around and try to mob him. When that happened, he would come zooming down to the cave and bang on the door with his beak until we let him in. He wasn't afraid of the crows. It was just he couldn't fight back when they tormented him. As for Weeps, he usually stayed right in the cave where he felt safe. One summer afternoon when we were at the cave, we decided to go for a swim. The 3 of us shucked off our clothes and raced for the sandbar, hollering at each other. In a half minute, we were in the water, splashing around and rolling in the slippery black mud along the edge of the sandbar. It was great stuff to fight with. Nice and soft and slithery. It packed into mushy mud balls that made a wonderful splash when they hit something. Whenever we went swimming, Wool would come along and find a perch in the hanging tree where he would watch the fun. He would get out on the big limb that overhung the water, and the more fuss and noise we made, the more excited he became. He would walk back and forth along the limb, hoo-hooing and ruffling his feathers, and you could tell he felt he was missing out on the fun. This particular day, he couldn't stand it any longer, so he came down out of the tree and waddled right over to the river's edge. We were That means I need more tea. We were skylarking. Wait, and then I lost my spot. Hold on. There it is. Okay. We were skylarking on the sandbar when I saw him, so I gave him a yell. Hey, Wool! Come here, Wool, old owl! Come on out here! Of course, I thought he would fly across the strip of open water and land on the dry sand where we were playing, but I forgot that Wool had never had any experience with water before, except his drinking bowl at home. He got his experience in a hurry, though. Instead of spreading his wings, he lifted up one foot very deliberately and started to walk across the water towards us. It didn't take him long to find out that he couldn't do that. There was an almighty splash and spray flew every which way. By the time we raced across and fished him out, he was half drowned and about the sickest looking bird you ever saw. His feathers were plastered down until he looked as skinny as a plucked chicken. The slimy black mud hadn't improved his looks either. I carried him ashore, but he didn't thank me for it. His feelings were hurt worse than he was, and after he had shaken most of the water out of his feathers, he went galumphing off through the woods toward home on foot. He was too wet to fly, without a backward glance at us. Toward the middle of July, Bruce and I got permission from our parents to spend a night in the cave. Murray couldn't come because his mother wouldn't let him. We took Wool and Weeps with us, and of course we had both dogs. In the afternoon, we went for a hike over the prairie looking for birds. Mutt, who was running ahead of us, flushed a prairie chicken off her nest. There were 10 eggs in the nest, and they were just hatching out. We sat down beside and watched. In an hour's time, 7 of the little chicks had hatched before our eyes. It was pretty exciting to see, and Wool seemed just as curious about it as we were. Then all of a sudden, 3 of the newly hatched little birds all slipped out of the nest and scuttled straight for Wool. Before he could move, they were underneath him, crowding against his big feet and peeping happily. I guess they thought he was their mother, because they hadn't seen their real mother yet. Wool was so surprised he didn't know what to do. He kept lifting up one foot and then the other to shake off the little ones. And when the other 4 babies joined the first 3, Wool began to get nervous. But finally he seemed to resign himself to being a mother. He fluffed his feathers out and lowered himself very gently to the ground. Bruce and I nearly died laughing. The sight of the baby prairie chickens popping their heads in and out through Wool's feathers, and that great big beak of his snapping anxiously in the air right over their heads was the silliest thing I'd ever seen. I guess Wool knew it was silly too, but he couldn't figure out how to get out of the mess he was in. He kept looking at me as if he were saying, "For heaven's sake, do something!" I don't know how long he would have stayed there, but we began to worry that the real mother might not find her chicks, so I finally lifted him up and put him on my shoulder, and we went back to the cave for supper. We had had a good laugh at Wool, but he had the laugh on us before the day was done. After we had eaten, we decided to go down to the riverbank and wait for the sun to set. A pair of coyotes lived on the opposite bank of the river, and every evening, just at sunset, one of them would climb the little hill and sit there howling. It was a scary sound, but we liked it, because it made us feel that it was the olden times, and the prairie belonged to us, to the buffaloes and Indians, and to the prairie wolves. Wool was sitting in the hanging tree, and Rex and Mutt had gone off somewhere on a hunting trip of their own. It was growing dusk when we heard a lot of crashing in the trees behind us. We turned around just as 2 big kids came into sight. They were 2 of the toughest kids in Saskatoon. If they hadn't come on us so suddenly, we would have been running before they ever saw us. But now, it was too late to run. They would have caught us before we could go 10 feet. The only thing we could do was sit where we were and hope they would leave us alone. What a hope that was! They came right over, and one of them reached down and grabbed Bruce and started to twist his arm behind his back. "Listen," he said, "we heard you kids have a cave someplace down here. You're too young to own a cave, so we're taking over. Show us where it is or I'll twist your arm right off." The other big kid made a grab for me, but I slipped past him and was just starting to run when he stuck his foot out and tripped me. And then he sat on me. "Say, Joe," he said to his pal, "I got an idea. Either these kids tell us where that cave is, or we tie 'em to the old hanging tree and leave 'em all night with the ghost." Just then, the coyote across the river gave a howl. All 4 of us jumped a little, what with the talk of ghosts. But Joe said, "That ain't nothing, just a coyote howling. You gonna tell us, kid, or do we tie you to the tree?" Bruce and I knew they were only trying to scare us, but we were scared all right. I was just opening my mouth to tell him where the cave was when Wool took a hand in things. He had been sitting on the big limb of the hanging tree, and since it was almost dark by then, he looked like a big white blob up there. I don't think he'd been paying much attention to what was happening on the ground below him, but when that coyote howled, he must have thought it was some kind of a challenge. He opened his beak and gave the owl hunting scream. Have you ever heard a horned owl scream? Usually they do it at night to scare mice or rabbits that happen to be hiding near into jumping or running. Then the owl swoops down and grabs them. If you've ever heard an owl scream, you'll know it's just about the most scary sound in all the world. When Wool cut it loose, it made even my skin creep, and I knew what it was. But the 2 big kids didn't know. Their heads jerked up, and they saw the ghostly white shape that was Wool up there in the hanging tree, and then they were off and running. They went right through the poplar trees like a couple of charging buffaloes, and we could still hear them breaking bush when they were half a mile away. My guess is they ran all the way to Saskatoon. When they were out of hearing, Bruce stood up and began rubbing his arm. Then he looked at Wool. "Boy," he said, "you sure scared those 2 roughnecks silly, but did you have to scare me out of my skin too?" "Hoo hoo 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 hoo," Wool chuckled as he floated down out of the tree and landed on my shoulder. Alright, that's it for today. I think our next reading is going to be our last one. Also, if you didn't notice, the cover is the picture of Wool on the handlebars and Weeps in the back of it with the dogs running around it. Well, thank you for having Stories and Tea with me, and I will see you next time.